It's Christmas Day 2025, which means it's only a year until the 2026 Doctor Who Christmas special. I personally don't find speculation videos all that interesting, so I'm not going to be talking about next year's Christmas special yet, because it's an entire year away and they haven't even started filming. Instead, I decided to look back on the previous Christmas specials and give short reviews on each of them. So to begin with the Christmas Invasion, this was the 10th Doctor's first episode, and that takes priority over it being a Christmas special. It's also the first post-regeneration episode of New Who, so it's about easing that transition from the 9th Doctor to the 10th Doctor, which means other characters are given priority over the 10th Doctor in order to help the audience along with it. So given that context, it's not really a point of criticism for me that the 10th Doctor isn't in it all that much. And actually, if you think about it, then he is essentially a Christmas present for the viewer, and the whole point of the episode is presenting the viewer with that present and then spending 45 minutes unwrapping it before another 15 celebrating that we now have it. But as the first Christmas special, there was no precedent because the Feast of Stephen is only a Christmas episode because it happened to coincide with that day. But I don't really consider it a Christmas special in the modern sense. So really, the Christmas Invasion was the first one, which means all it needed to be was a good episode. It didn't need to be boundary breaking or anything. And the success of this episode was enough to prove the concept of a Doctor Who Christmas special as an annual tradition, or as a mostly annual tradition. So really it's because of this episode that there are any others, because this one proved it could work, which I think makes it very unique amongst Doctor Who episodes. That this was an entirely new format within the format, in a way that had never really been done before. I don't think the Christmas Invasion is the best Christmas special, but I can't think of anything bad about it. And this probably wouldn't be the highest scoring Christmas special, but I think if you were to ask people who have seen all of them, I do think this would be the one that the fewest number of people dislike. The 2006 Christmas special was The Runaway Bride, which is also a quasi-sequel to the Christmas Invasion because it has killer Christmas trees and the robo-forms. A lot of the scenes remind the viewer of the previous Christmas special, the iconography and things. But this is also, like the Christmas Invasion, the first episode of New Who after one of the original members of the cast had departed. And so just as the Christmas Invasion had to convince the audience that Doctor Who could work without Christopher Eccleston, The Runaway Bride had to convince them that it could also work without Billie Piper. And also, Doctor Who has a revolving door cast, and this is the first episode in which the door has now revolved a full rotation, and there are none of the original regular actors in it. So this episode also had to convince the audience that having a revolving door cast can work, that you can't just replace these two actors, you can actually replace any of the actors in the show as an ongoing thing. And also, Russell T Davies wanted some time to elapse in the Doctor's life before he meets his next companion. Rather than going to Martha straight after Doomsday, some time has to elapse first for the absence of Rose to really set in. So really Donna becomes the first guest companion, which then is common practice for future Christmas specials, where you have just a guest companion for that one episode only. So The Runaway Bride, in a way, establishes the traditional form of the Doctor Who Christmas special in a way that the Christmas Invasion didn't. But the only thing notable about the episode for me is that it is basically a prologue to Series 4 retrospectively, and if Donna hadn't come back for Series 4, would anyone care about this episode? I don't know that they necessarily would. It's fun enough, it's entertaining enough, I just don't know if anyone would actually care about it had Donna not come back for Series 4 and for the 60th anniversary specials. I don't know. So really, the episode exists just to be filler, and filler isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's the motorway chase scene, which I love, and I also like the fact that for a Christmas special, one of the most memorable scenes is the Doctor observing the creation of Earth as a natural scientific process. And this is an episode broadcast on Christmas Day. I just like that they put that in there. So this isn't a bad episode, but it was clearly written to be an episode that's just holding the series over until the story continues properly with the next season. But in so doing, it also established that actually you can use the Christmas special for that as a sort of watershed. Which then leads to the 2007 Christmas special, Voyage of the Damned. The appeal of Doctor Who is that it can cross over into any genre, and Voyage of the Damned is the first time, as far as I can tell, that they did a disaster movie episode. Which is why I don't understand the criticism that the third act is too over the top, it's too melodramatic, because that's the point. It's supposed to be a disaster movie episode, and a big, dramatic, over-the-top third act is a trope of the genre that it's copying. Disaster films have melodramatic finales, like Doctor Who does most of the time anyway. This does what every good episode of Doctor Who does. It introduces new characters, gets me to feel a certain way about them by writing them and casting them in a certain way, kills some of them so that I have an emotional reaction to it, and then gives the survivors a conclusion of some sort that also gives me an emotional reaction to it. This is the main reason that Doctor Who is such a hard show to write, because it's like writing a film every week, where you have guest characters that have to be introduced, and then developed, and then given some sort of conclusion, usually within 1 or 2 episodes. And I actually think that the extended running time, even for the standards of a Christmas special, this one is quite long, is actually an advantage, because there's more time for those characters to be explored. People like Morvin and Foon, Rixton Slade. I think this episode has one of the best one-off cast ensembles of the series, and that would still be true even if Kylie Minogue hadn't been cast as Astrid Peth. So the disaster movie genre works really well with that same format, because the audience need to care when a character dies. And they also need to care about the survivors, or not care about the survivors, as the case may be. So it turns out that actually Doctor Who and the disaster movie actually is a perfect combination. Because if you think about it, the disaster movie genre isn't that far removed from the base Under Siege plot of classic Doctor Who that was introduced during the Innes Lloyd years of the show. And I didn't really get that until I watched it back recently. But and then everything just clicked together. The 2008 Christmas special is The Next Doctor, and I'm going to say it straight up, the premise of this episode is clickbait. It exists to be clickbait. Calling a Christmas special The Next Doctor is a ratings stunt. David Tennant had only announced 2 months prior that he wouldn't be leading the next season. It had only been in October of that year that he'd revealed he wouldn't be doing Series 5. And at this point, the Doctor Who Christmas special had become an event in itself, even outside of the main show. And an episode of this nature probably wouldn't have been written if the series didn't have annual Christmas specials. You can't do an episode like The Next Doctor mid-season, because it's so obviously not true, because it's mid-season. A Doctor does an entire complete season. So that would obviously not be true. But for a Christmas special, it has more credibility, which is why I think it wouldn't have been made if they didn't do Christmas specials. And also, the fact is that was 2008. So we're coming up to being 20 years removed from this episode. Everybody knows that David Morrissey isn't actually the next Doctor after David Tennant. So it can't have the same effect on new viewers as it did on contemporary viewers anyway. So the question is, why would anyone watching it for the first time now have any reason to care about whether or not David Morrissey really is the next Doctor when they already know he isn't? And I think that has really limited this episode's shelf life more than the other Christmas specials, that it was really just a rating stunt for the time that became obsolete really as soon as Matt Smith was cast, and his casting was announced the next month anyway. And he was cast around Christmas of 2008. Now, you might say, okay, but what about Titanic? Because we all know that the Titanic sinks in the end, and yet Titanic is still a great film. So surely, does it have anything going for it even outside of knowing the ending? The film Titanic isn't about the ending, it's about everything that leads up to it and everything it represents, and it's about the characters and stuff. The thing is, though, I don't think this episode really does have anything going for it outside of the main gimmick, because the Cybermen's plot is boring. The Cyber King is a ridiculous villain, and I've never taken it seriously, not even at the time. This episode premiered when I was 12. I have never taken the Cyber King seriously. I thought it was ridiculous even as a 12-year-old. Like a giant mechanical cyberpunk Cyberman walking over a city. Even as a 12-year-old, I thought that was dumb. And Russell T Davies himself has confessed to thinking that he actually didn't write the climax as well as he could have done, and that it would have been more interesting if Hartigan decided to destroy the Cyber King herself rather than the Doctor doing it, and that way she would have had some sort of closure. So even Russell T Davies himself has said that the third act isn't as good as it could be. But there is one thing it has going for it, which is Jackson Lake's relationship with the Doctor, because this is really the first time, outside of the Master, I suppose, the Doctor meets someone who actually knows what it's like to be him. And that's a dynamic we haven't seen before for a companion. But the problem is that so much of the episode is about the mystery of Jackson Lake's identity that this aspect of their relationship isn't explored much anyway. Most of it is about, is he really the next Doctor? And after that, there's just, when we find out that he's Jackson Lake, after that, there's mainly just lots of action. They don't really get much time to actually talk much. So that aspect of their relationship, that he's finally met someone who knows what it's like to be him, doesn't really go anywhere. And that scene at the end where they walk off together, and they're sort of like bros now, I would have loved to have seen that more. And I think it could have been really interesting to go back to that at some point later on. But they never do. The 2009 Christmas special is The End of Time Part 1. And this is really the Christmas special that stands out as being the most different from the others, because The End of Time is the conclusion of the specials that linked Series 4 and Series 5. And really those specials were scheduled for particular times of year, like Planet of the Dead, that was an Easter special. The End of Time Part 2, that was the New Year's Day special for 2010. The Waters of Mars was just broadcast apparently on a completely random Sunday in November. And at this point, the Christmas special had become a tradition that they didn't want to break. So that means that one of the specials was going to end up being a Christmas special anyway. But Russell T Davies ended up writing the last two specials as one 2-part story, and it was part 1 that was picked for the Christmas slot. So this is the only Christmas special to be part of a multi-part story, which means that really its only function is to set up part 2. It doesn't tell a complete story in and of itself. So it can't really be assessed on its own like the others can. Given the context, its status as a Christmas special had to basically be after the fact because they had bigger things to be dealing with, which means that this is the least Christmassy Christmas special they've ever done. For almost none of the episode is it actually apparent that it's set at Christmas. In most scenes there aren't even any Christmas decorations, we only see them sparingly. The one snow scene is set on an ice planet where Christmas isn't celebrated anyway, and it's pretty obvious that it was filmed in spring, summer, or whenever, because there's a lot of green. You see bushes and leafy trees, and it's clearly not Christmas weather. And compared with the other Christmas specials, it really stands out as the one that was manoeuvred into that position rather than being created for it. I don't think this is the worst Christmas special, but it's the worst example of a Christmas special because it's the least Christmassy one. The tone is very angsty and grim. A lot of the episode takes place in a wasteland. All the Doctor really does is mope around, talking about how he's going to regenerate soon. And he spends most of the episode acting like it's Blue Monday. There are a lot of scenes that, watched in isolation, you wouldn't know it's a Christmas special at all. I don't know how any of this could have actually been considered fun family entertainment. And I know that Doctor Who doesn't always have to be fun family entertainment, but this is a Christmas special, and even the other Christmas specials have dark moments, but they're still fun. So this one, it's a little bit emo. It's very tonally unsuited to Christmas. And also, when it comes to the end of time, all the most memorable scenes are in part 2 anyway. But then we come to the 2010 Christmas special, The Christmas Carol. And there should be a law named after this principle, that the more Christmas specials a show has, the more likely they are to eventually do an adaptation of A Christmas Carol. In fact, I personally think that Charles Dickens should have a story by credit. A Christmas Carol by Stephen Moffat from a story by Charles Dickens. I read the original novella every Christmas. I think it's the best story ever written in the English language, and there is a reason that it's been adapted endlessly. And Stephen Moffat clearly reveres the material as much as I do. This episode could have just been a gimmick, but it's not. It's a proper story. Because Stephen Moffat respects the source material so much, he decided to adapt it into a proper story rather than it just being a gimmick that goes through the motions. Because most adaptations just see the original novella as a template that everyone's already familiar with. So they don't really think about the actual text or about what any of it means. Only a few adaptations actually explore the Scrooge character properly. For most adaptations, he's just a plot device. And Stephen Moffat was able to combine the source material with Doctor Who perfectly because he has a deep understanding of both. The whole point of the episode is a character study of Kazran, who of course is the Scrooge of this story. Why is he the way he is? Could his life have turned out differently? And I don't really know of any other episode that explores a character psychologically as much as this one, because of the way that Stephen Moffat uses the concept of time travel as part of the story, of new memories, and what if things had worked out differently than how they did. This is really the only episode that actually uses time travel to explore someone's psyche. And I think that's what makes this so well written and so well acted. And I do think that Charles Dickens would be pleased with how he's reinterpreted the story. I really do. I've seen multiple adaptations of this. This one is definitely the best since the Muppet version. And also, I just want to say, if you like this episode as much as I do, but you haven't read the original novella, I implore you to read it. It's in the public domain, it's easy to find, you already know the story, you know like the 5 main things that happen: Marley, Christmas past, Christmas present, Christmas future, the end. And I guarantee you that because you know the original story enough, the text and the way it's written will make enough sense to you. There's stuff in there that's a bit obsolete, certain terminology and objects, but for the most part, I find that it makes enough sense on its own. In fact, this isn't just the best Christmas special of Doctor Who, it's one of the best Christmas specials of any series. But then, in 2011, Stephen Moffat followed it up with The Doctor, the Widow and the Wardrobe, which is something of a spiritual successor to A Christmas Carol, because Stephen Moffat was He was clearly inspired by the success of A Christmas Carol to attempt a repeat of that by drawing influence from another work of winter-themed literature, and in this case, the influence was The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, and the original book was one of the primary influences for Doctor Who. Doctor Who was described in its early stages as sort of C.S. Lewis meets H.G. Wells. So on paper, this could have been a perfect match, and yet it's easily the worst Christmas special. And in Doctor Who magazine's 60 Years poll, this episode ended up being the lowest ranked of the entire Matt Smith era. I think it has a good story. The problem is the tone. This is when the 11th Doctor started to become too silly. He'd managed to get a perfect balance during series 5 and 6, but with this episode, this is when he started to go slightly too far with it. But also, the problem is, he has absolutely no dynamic with any of the guest companions. But Claire Skinner, who is funny in Outnumbered, is not right for this material. I don't know who is, but Claire Skinner, she's not dramatic enough an actor. And Holly Earle, who is a good actor and has gone on to do a lot of good things, is clearly miscast, and I find it hard to believe that Lily is part of the same family as Madge and Cyril. And Cyril is such a stereotypical character that there's nothing interesting about him. In fact, both Cyril and Lily are both annoying and stupid, and then Madge is very lightweight. And I feel like that makes the whole episode feel very saccharine and overly sentimental and a bit trite. And as it progresses, it becomes increasingly cringe. It doesn't have enough of an edge to it. Now, I'm not saying it should be like The End of Time Part 1, but even the more light-hearted episodes need at least a little bit of an edge. There needs to be at least a sense of an underlying darkness or danger, rather than it just being very happy-clappy. You know what I mean? Unfortunately, though, 2012 isn't really any better, because 2012 gave us the Snowmen, and like The End of Time Part 1, this is another really anomalous Christmas special, because Series 7 was split over 2 years. Part 1 was broadcast in late 2012 and was about the departure of Karen Gillan and Arthur Darvill. Part 2 was then broadcast in early 2013 and was about the introduction of Clara Oswald. The 2012 Christmas special was then placed between each half, without being counted as part of either. It's not an episode of Series 7, it was just broadcast between the two halves of that season. So it's both an epilogue to Series 7 Part 1, as well as a prologue to Series 7 Part 2, but it's not actually an episode of Series 7. If I'm understanding it right. I think the big problem with this episode is that it's mostly a series of disparate elements that don't hold together well. First of all, the Paternoster Gang. I've never really liked any of these characters. I find the idea of them very gimmicky. I never believed in the relationship between Vastra and Jenny. It only exists because we're told it exists. And Strax is by far the worst character Stephen Moffat ever created. The Sontarans are easily the number 3 Doctor Who monster, right? You've got the Daleks, then the Cybermen, and I'm talking like not in terms of individuals here. Then at number 3, probably the Sontarans? And yet Stephen Moffat only ever treated them as a joke. And Stephen Moffat pushed the Paternoster Gang as if they were the next big thing, to the point that they began to overshadow the Doctor. I think surrounding him with too many characters is a problem. We saw that during the Peter Davison years when you had Adric and Nyssa and Tegan at the same time. We had that with the Chris Chibnall era where you have Graham and Yaz and Ryan. And we've even seen that during RTD2 when you have the entire what I suppose is like the new unit family. There were just way too many of them, and I think that's a big problem that we also got to an extent, not as much, but to an extent with the Paternoster gang. Also, Ian McKellen is reduced to a voice role that really didn't require an actor of his talent. I feel like he was completely wasted by being cast in a voice role that doesn't require much of him, and he doesn't even have many lines anyway. Also, Richard E. Grant is wasted in the role of Simeon. The material and the character is very thin. Why do they need someone like Richard E. Grant? And also, what exactly is Simeon's plan? I still don't know. There's a big lack of focus with this episode. The Paternoster gang have much more screen time than they need. Simeon isn't developed enough for his character to be a convincing threat or have a memorable plan. And also, why does the Doctor dress as Sherlock Holmes, apart from for that to be a Who-lock gag? What was his reason for doing that, other than for Stephen Moffat to exploit the whole Who-lock thing on Tumblr? I really don't get it. Will future viewers get the joke that, oh, Stephen Moffat is referencing the other show that he was also doing at the same time, and that people on Tumblr were constantly wanting a crossover between? It's also revealed that the episode is actually a stealth prequel to both The Abominable Snowmen and The Web of Fear, and it's so inorganically done that it comes across as Moffat just nailing it on to the side of the episode after the fact. And then it ends just as it seems to have gotten going. The twist ending that we're not actually being introduced to Clara in this episode, but a splinter of Clara like the one in the Dalek Asylum, and that the real Clara now exists in the modern day, with the Doctor going off to find her, that was a good twist ending. But I feel like that was also the only part of it that was interesting, and it comes right at the end, and then there's a trailer for Series 7 Part 2, and I feel like it reduces the episode to just being a way of baiting the audience to watch Series 7 Part 2, rather than being a good episode in its own right. But also, the big problem is that Clara's storyline in Series 7 is basically bullshit. She was created to be a mystery first for the Doctor to solve, rather than a character. So she was essentially a plot device. And if Clara had been a conventional companion and not introduced until Series 7 Part 2, the Snowmen could have been a standalone adventure with a guest companion without having to incorporate so many different plot points. And I think that would have been a lot simpler. The Clara storyline in Series 7 didn't really work, and unfortunately the Snowmen is a major episode in that story arc, and it's more about the story arc than the episode itself, and I think that's what holds it back. Then in 2013 we get The Time of the Doctor. Now, there are two ways of writing a Doctor Who Christmas special. The first is to write an episode that is specifically designed for Christmas viewing with its own isolated plot, and the second is to write more of a proper episode that just incorporates elements of Christmas because that's when it's going to be broadcast, an episode that just happens to be a Christmas special rather than something designed to be a Christmas special first. The concept of the Matt Smith era was for it to have one overarching story, that his last episode would be the conclusion or the last chapter of an arc rather than a standalone episode, that the Doctor is sort of fighting a war against himself in reverse, with his last episode basically being a prequel to that, but from his point of view it's the end, which meant his last episode was always going to be about the Siege of Trenzalore and about how it led to the Silencers' war against him. It just happened to be that he left in a Christmas special rather than a season finale, which meant The Time of the Doctor became the second type of Christmas special. That is a proper episode that just incorporates elements of Christmas because that's when it's broadcast. The only actual Christmas elements in the episode are the town on Trenzalore being called Christmas and it being Christmas Day in Clara's present. which is where we also get the whole thing with the Christmas hats and the turkey being cooked in the TARDIS and the poem Thoughts on a Clock coming from the Christmas cracker. That's about it, really. And I feel like Stephen Moffat struck a good balance. This is actually a much better episode than I remember. Would it make much sense to the average viewer? Probably not. But the need to include so many things ended up working in Stephen Moffat's favour, I think. Because as a writer, me personally, I find it easier to reduce plot rather than expand it, to compress a story rather than to draw it out. And I get the impression from watching this, I can just sense this when I watch it, that the episode basically wrote itself, and that all he had to do was listen to what it was telling him. I remember this episode as having been a bit of a mess. I was pleasantly surprised that I liked it as much as I did. So then, 2014, last Christmas. This is the 10th Christmas special, and just as they'd done their own version of A Christmas Carol, the next thing that was inevitable was them doing a Meet Santa Claus episode. And actually, the Doctor had a photograph of himself with Santa in A Christmas Carol, and yet this is never mentioned, which is a bit weird. I won't bury the lead here. Last Christmas is an hour of mostly bullshit. The Dreams Within Dreams episode, it might sound complex, but it leads to the episode being repetitive. Just the same thing over and over again, made to sound more complicated than it really is. And also, each layer of the dream is the same. Because Clara's dream is of being with Danny at Christmas, and yet the other characters who are collectively dreaming don't experience a different situation for each dream layer that they have, even though Clara's is different, but each time they wake up, it's in the same situation. I don't really understand this. I found it difficult to follow the mechanics of it, and the plot is just the characters realising they're still dreaming over and over again, and if they had kept waking up in a different scenario each time, it might have added something, an extra layer of tension, maybe, instead of it just being the same thing over and over again. Also, the sleigh flying sequence, it works well for the 11th Doctor, because he's that kind of character. It does not work for the 12th Doctor at all. That sequence, I know it's supposed to be light-hearted fun, I just thought it was cringe. That yippee-yi-yay line is completely wrong for a Doctor like Peter Capaldi, and I really don't understand why Stephen Moffat wrote him this way. At all. I like the idea that Stephen Moffat was going for, that random strangers experience an adventure together in a shared dream, in which they're completely different people from who they really are, only to then wake up as their real selves and forget what they've experienced, and the other people in the dream with them. I like that idea, and actually it reminds me of a Japanese novel called Lonely Castle in the Mirror, which is written by Mizuki Sugimura, and was also turned into an anime film a few years ago. The shared dream is an interesting plot mechanic, because Stephen Moffat likes to bring disparate characters together in odd ways, and on paper, it made for an interesting episode. The execution is quite dull, oddly enough, and I'm surprised an episode with this premise and concept to it turned out to be so dull. And I don't think it's the worst Christmas special, but I do think it's the one that's the greatest waste of potential. So 2015 was The Husbands of Riversong, and overall I had fun with it. I like the chemistry between Peter Capaldi and Alex Kingston. The 12th Doctor has a more organic dynamic with Riversong than the 11th Doctor does, and of course there's the iconic It's My Go scene, which was brilliant. And there's some real cracking dialogue in this as well. Stephen Moffat's really good at writing that sort of back and forth banter between characters in a way that could, from a lesser writer, come across as just being like crappy Marvel quips. But from Stephen Moffat, it has more of a flow to it. This is really more like a regular length episode plus a mini episode rather than one complete special. Most of the episode is a screwball comedy, but then the last act is an emotional denouement about the Doctor and River finally going to Beryllium. And that denouement is emotional, but it's tonally inconsistent with what led up to it. Stephen Moffat, he wanted to finally close the loop of River Song's storyline, but it comes across more as something that was just thrown in there at the end, rather than being the premise of the episode from the beginning. And I think this held it back from being as emotional as it could have been. What exactly is this episode about? The ending is the most significant thing about it, because it ties up a loose end that had been left hanging for the past 7 years, but it comes across as an afterthought, and it isn't given the significance it should have had. I don't think the episode is missing anything per se, but it does seem like a compromise between two different ways to do the episode. And I think it's held back by structural and tonal issues, but they're not bad enough for me to say I dislike it. I am thoroughly entertained by it, but when I actually start to piece it together in my head, I realise this doesn't necessarily work as well intellectually as it does emotionally. And you can take that comment for whatever you think it's worth. 2016, The Return of Dr. Mysterio. This is more of an extended reference to the superhero genre than an actual story. It's as though Stephen Moffat had simply written a checklist for himself after reading TV tropes. Presumably, the episode was written due to the popularity of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but the problem is, on a Doctor Who budget, it ends up resembling the only thing that you get when you do the Marvel Cinematic Universe on a Doctor Who budget, which is the Arrowverse. And I feel like RTD2 in particular has really hammered this home by going all in on that, rather than doing the opposite. I think it was a mistake to try and mimic the most popular genre in all of cinema, because that's obviously not something Doctor Who can do. And if anything, the popularity of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is exactly the reason to not do it, because you have everything to lose. Plus, and here's the really big thing, a superhero can't exist in the Doctor Who universe without being a gimmick. That character will never be as interesting as the Doctor is, because the Doctor is a unique character in that universe, and as soon as you put a superhero in there, he's never going to be as interesting as the Doctor, and for a superhero, that's going to actually be more apparent than it would be for anybody else. The Ghost is not interesting. He's overshadowed by the Doctor, and he's way too derivative of Superman, and I understand that's kind of the point. I know that every superhero is ultimately derivative of Superman, and that the concept of the Ghost is that he's supposed to be an homage to Superman, more the Christopher Reeve version. But to make him interesting in the episode, the Doctor often takes a back seat, like he's just sort of hanging around while the rest of the episode happens. But that only highlights how boring a character the Ghost actually is, when you have to make the Doctor just sort of sit out entire moments of the episode that he should be more involved in. If you have to do that to make the Ghost an interesting character, it only emphasises how uninteresting he is. A superhero in the Doctor Who universe simply doesn't work. Supposedly, the Doctor Who universe can include potentially anything, but I think having a superhero in there is going too far. I think that's maybe... If there's a line, it's there. And I do respect Stephen Moffat for attempting that experiment, because Doctor Who is all about crossing into different genres, and they had never done a superhero episode before. The Mind Robber doesn't count, because Carcass is in the land of fiction. But the experiment was to ask the question, can a superhero exist in the Doctor Who universe? And the answer, it seems, is no. 2017, Twice Upon a Time. So what happened was, Stephen Moffat intended to finish with Series 10, But then he discovered that Chris Chibnall intended to begin with Series 11, and so extended his term to the 2017 Christmas special, because otherwise, if he didn't do that, he wasn't going to write one, because he'd be finished by then. Chris Chibnall wasn't going to write it, because he wouldn't have started by then. So if he hadn't extended his tenure by one more episode, there wouldn't have been a Christmas special that year. That's why he wrote it. Which means this episode is one he hadn't intended to write, and only did as a placeholder. And also, I think it's pretty obvious that this was a very last-minute thing, because the regeneration is clearly set up in the finale. We begin with the regeneration at the end, and then the rest of the episode is a flashback leading up to that. Then, though, the Doctor ends up putting off his regeneration to do the Christmas special. Had this been clearer to Moffat earlier, I don't think it would have turned out this way. I don't know why he would have done it that way. Surely, if he had known with enough advance notice, he would have just written the finale of Series 10 as whatever, without the regeneration aspect, and then Capaldi's last episode would have just been a self-contained Christmas special. So I think the fact that the regeneration actually carries over from the Series 10 finale, and the Doctor spends the whole of this episode putting it off, I think that proves that it was a very last-minute thing for Stephen Moffat to do. And also, it means that the 12th Doctor, simply for production purposes, has to put off his regeneration for a whole episode for completely arbitrary reasons. It is completely unbelievable that he wouldn't be able to face regenerating when he'd already done it so many times in the past. And for some reason, Stephen Moffat decided that the 12th Doctor should meet the 1st Doctor before his regeneration, so the 12th Doctor can remember how scared he was by regenerating the first time. Except it's such an obvious retcon that I could never believe in the reality of the situation, because the entire thing was so clearly contrived. Why is this the idea that Stephen Moffat came up with? I don't know. But the problem is, having the 1st Doctor in the episode is just an idea, it's not a story. But so much of this episode is about the fact that the 1st Doctor is in it, that it doesn't actually have a story. Almost nothing actually happens in this episode. Most of the episode is the 12th Doctor and the 1st Doctor just wandering through a maze. The enemy turns out to actually be nothing. There are inane conversations to pad out the running time. The Captain's inclusion in the episode is totally pointless. The character has absolutely no reason to be there. I don't know that it was just to give Mark Gatiss a role, but frankly, I can't think of a better reason for that. The 12th Doctor's decision to then face his regeneration after all just happens. There's nothing that helps him come to it. And even his monologue at the end comes across as something that's only there just to get the episode to the required running time. As though Stephen Moffat was writing his assignment the night before it was due and had to meet a minimum word count, so he just padded things out as much as possible. And the fact that he didn't really want to write this episode, he only did it because he thought that he had to, I think that explains why there is such an obvious lack of enthusiasm on his part for anything that goes on in this episode. It really comes across more as though what had actually happened was the 12th Doctor's final story had been the Series 10 finale, but then somebody had written fan fiction in which the 12th Doctor has one last adventure that they squeezed into the final scenes of The Doctor Falls, in the same way that Stephen Moffat squeezed the 1st Doctor's inclusion into the final scenes of The 10th Planet. It comes across more like that, but it is that. Stephen Moffat and Peter Capaldi were such a fantastic Doctor showrunner combination, and yet Their final episode ended up being something that is completely disposable. The Christmas specials returned in 2023 with The Church on Ruby Road, and to be honest, it's difficult to find anything to like about this when it's the introduction to an era that didn't really work. This episode is Ruby's introduction, and it's obvious that she was intended to be the companion for 2 seasons rather than just 1. Mrs. Flood lives next door to Ruby, but then when we meet Belinda, Mrs. Flood is living next door to Belinda, and there's no explanation for this. Similarly, Belinda's story arc was clearly intended to be the second half of Ruby's story arc, because Belinda ends up becoming a single mother to raise a daughter on her own, like Carla someday raising Ruby on her own, and Belinda's daughter is Poppy, who's first introduced in Space Babies, which is Ruby's first adventure, and who Belinda never met, so there's no explanation of why Belinda imagined Poppy in the story In the Engine or Wish world, and the finale of Ruby's single season as a regular was clearly not the original plan. Ruby's backstory had such a rushed explanation in Empire of Death that it was clearly rewritten late in production of the season, and that the following season, what was left of Ruby's story was given to this new companion without any of the themes or development being changed. It's a bit like the Snowmen. It introduces a companion whose story arc never really grabbed me. It wasn't much of a success. I felt as though it could have been much more interesting than it was. Instead of such a massive letdown, it was very much a damp squib. The problem with an episode that exists mostly to set up an entire era of the show is that if that era doesn't work, it's difficult to really say anything good about that episode, because it's all set up for things that didn't go anywhere. And not only did it not go anywhere, nothing interesting happened while it stayed where it was anyway. That's all I can really say about this one. The most recent Christmas special is Joy to the World, which I liked a lot more than The Church on Ruby Road. I think this is Ncuti Gatwa's best performance. I also find it interesting that it's taken them 19 years to do a Christmas special that actually incorporates Bethlehem in the year 1, which is clearly a gag, because biblical historians would tell you that Christmas probably did not actually happen in the year 1. It was maybe like 3, 4, or 5, but whatever. I thought there was Stephen Moffat's usual zingy dialogue and timey-wimey plots, and the way that he can just sort of communicate entire conversations in single lines, and he's clearly got a lot of really good ideas. I like the idea of the Doctor having to spend a whole year on Earth linearly. That was really cool. He uses the same bootstrap paradox for a combination number as he does in A Christmas Carol, which was a nice throwback. I think that this episode, it has a really good cast as well. I like Anita, and I also like the Joel Fry character, and I also like Joy herself. I think this has a really good combination of cool stuff, and the way that Stephen Moffat just throws all these things in together, it's kind of like watching multiple films at the same time, and yet somehow it actually works. It doesn't come across as a mess. It works more than it doesn't. I really liked it, actually. I was surprised by this one. I think, overall, this is probably the best episode of the RTD2 era, if I had to pick one. So there we are. Those are my thoughts on the Doctor Who Christmas specials. Next Christmas, there is another Christmas special. What's going to happen? Who the hell knows? But I'll tell you one thing. While I can't say I'm necessarily excited for it, while I can't say I'm expecting anything good from it, what I will say is this. I've never been more intrigued and more curious by what's going to happen in any episode before. Because based on the way the last season ended, they're clearly going to do whatever the hell they want. And honestly, I think finding out itself, regardless of how much I like the results, is going to be part of the fun. So there we are. Merry Christmas.